The views expressed in this podcast are not meant to represent the Canadian Future Party or Canadian Future Party Youth Wing at large. Hey everyone, this is a moment of truth from the CFP Youth, a bi-monthly podcast where members from the Youth Wing of the Canadian Future Party and guests speak on major issues in Canada.
The Canadian Future Party is a new centrist party in Canada, offering Canadian voters a party that is moderate yet committed to fighting for Canada and our democracy. The goal is to flesh out major topics of debate and provide meaningful context behind them with our own perspectives.
Our podcast format may vary episode to episode. Sometimes it'll be a discussion-based episode like today, while others may be a debate or an interview. Likewise, we'll have a rotating set of hosts. Today's host will be hosted by myself, Rob Rock, the Policy and Outreach Director, and
the Ontario Youth Representative, Nathan Bless. We will be discussing Canadian resource development, what is happening currently, what's planned, and our potential as a nation.
Thanks, Nathan. So popping into our current resource development, as most people listening to this should probably know, Canada is a very resource development heavy country. Between 15 and 20% of Canadian GDP comes from natural resources, which is pretty high for a highly developed nation. And a lot of that comes from oil, whether it's oil sands or liquid natural gas. So I would like, first of all, Nathan, your thoughts on the fact that, we have such a resource developed economy.
Yeah, it's the great challenge that we face when compared to a lot of other developed nations, which rely on more diverse, less fickle forms of economy and money generation. But on the other hand, it's what we're good at. We have oil and natural gas, natural minerals like gold, iron, uranium, and the vast forests, fisheries, agriculture, all that. So it's our strength. I don't see why we shouldn't play towards it.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that being blessed with such a large, country that we have, it's natural that we have a lot of resources kind of concentrated within our borders. And I think that it would be silly not to take advantage of those things, like you were saying. And so I just wanted to touch on some of those key numbers. Canada produces 6 million barrels of oil per day. So when we're filling up our cars, and we usually do it by liters here in Canada, it's very interesting to hear that we're producing millions of barrels of oil per day. It's also interesting that while we produce that amount of oil, we still have to import a lot because the side of things that Canada isn't as great at is refining. Nathan, do you have any thoughts about refinement?
Yeah, that's perhaps our biggest weakness, is we produce all this oil, millions and millions of barrels a day, and we don't have the capacity to even remotely refine it all. I know New Brunswick has the Irving oil refineries, and in Ontario and Alberta, BC, there are all other little refineries, but they just can't compete or can't keep up, I should say. And it's certainly disappointing or perhaps frustrating that we sell our oil to the US, they refine it and sell it back to us. It's maybe something we need to tackle in the future.
Absolutely. I think you're touching on a big point there. We see a lot of initiatives in Canada, especially right now coming out of Alberta, where they want to increase oil production, which I can understand when, especially that province's economy is very much based on oil production, that would be a major concern. But like you were just raising, I think it's very important that while we talk about things like increasing oil production, that we try our best to maintain our ability to refine that oil so that we're not just producing tons and tons of oil and not truly reaping the benefits of either selling a finished product, which would gain a lot more money, or having a finished product more available for our country ourselves to lower gas prices for the average consumer, especially when Alberta currently is heavily conservative led and a major conservative talking point is gas prices. It's interesting that we don't see them talking about refinement as much.
Absolutely. Self-sufficiency is always extremely important, and it is rather disappointing that Alberta, despite its support for oil and gas, is seemingly unwilling to allow major refinery projects, despite the fact it would be beneficial to the average consumer with lower gas prices. It would create many more jobs. It would benefit our economy. It's a good thing across the board, but it's not happening.
Yeah, I agree. And you think that it would allow them to produce more oil if they had more ways to refine it. Like there would be more impetus for not just, people in Alberta, but foreign investors to come in and pour money into projects to get oil out of Canada. But like you're saying, it doesn't seem to be happening at the moment. But we're talking a lot about oil. I want to be clear when we're talking about resources as a country, we have more than just oil. So I know Nathan, you mentioned earlier on in the call Canada is a major player in like the gold market. In the uranium market is a very important one, as well as potash and potassium. So do you have any thoughts on our mining projects?
Mining is the bread and butter for a lot of Canada. We're top 10 producer of a whole long list of natural minerals: platinum, titanium, gold, nickel, cobalt, iron ore, lithium, zinc, copper, sulfur, graphite, salt, uranium, and potash. Large parts of the country rely on mining. The Northern Territories, particularly Northwest Territories, Northern Ontario, Sudbury, North Bay, Timmins, and in parts of Atlantic Canada, Quebec, Saskatchewan. It's a big deal, mining, and it's something we should reap the rewards of. There's a massive demand, an increasing demand for all sorts of these natural minerals, and we have the reserves and the means to produce them. So
Absolutely. And I think one thing that a lot of Canadians might not be taking into consideration when it comes to these precious materials is not just Canada wants them. So lots of developed nations need these minerals and these resources that we have access to in our country and are willing to buy them from us at top dollar. But outside of willing to buy them from us, they're also a strategic concern. So lately in Canada, we've had concerns from our southern neighbor, the United States, about potentially wanting to make us a state or annexing us or that type of things. But one of the major things that Canadians aren't considering is that some of that want or some of that drive to annex us or to include us within their country is to get access to our resources because we aren't producing them at a rate that the world needs us to.
absolutely. And there's the other thing that a lot of the other places that produce them, like, say, Democratic Republic of Congo, which produces copper, uranium, lots of stuff like that. Environmentally, they have little, if any, standards. The workers are treated little better as slaves, and the money is just being funneled into corrupt warlords and other unsavory types. So, with the demand, why don't we step in where we have stronger environmental regulation, some of the best in the world, and it would benefit our economy? So, it's a win win for our Western allies. They get the natural resources, we benefit from it, and we do less damage to the environment than some of the other countries who do the mining.
Absolutely. And I think you touched on another great fact there of talking about, human rights concerns because it is true for a Canadian worker to take out one, I know ton is a big amount, but let's say 1 ton of cobalt from the earth versus a worker from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. They may be able to do it at a significantly reduced price comparatively because of slave labor and other human rights concerns. But I think that when we're talking about selling to major, I don't want to say Western, but we'll say developed nations, they actually do take things like that into consideration and would, in a lot of chances, be willing to pay more for a, let's say, a cleaner product than something that's mined via slavery or other means like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I see it, we should get to it. We have lots of undeveloped areas of natural resources in all across Canada. So maybe it's time for our government to get on it and work with private partners if needed to set up some more mining operations, get our product to market.
Absolutely. And then the last major area of resources, I think there's maybe two more, but the second last one, I guess, then would be forestry. I think that Canada, being such again, as we've spoken before, such a large nation, a large country, we have a massive amount of green space available, especially considering we've taken the time already to put in environmental practices around sustainability in our forestry. And so when we do commit to massive forestry, in a lot of cases, we are putting equal money or slightly less money into restoring other nature preserves and ensuring that we're going to have forestry as an industry going forward. Do you have any thoughts about our forestry industry?
Yeah, for sure. As you say, compared to some of the other big forestry players like, say, Russia, our environmental standards are miles ahead. We don't clear cut for the most part. There's laws mandating that for every tree a forestry company chops down, they plant one, two, maybe three new ones in their place. And even pulp mills and sawmills have a lot more environmental protections around them. And we have huge forests, like vast, incomprehensibly large forests that we can take advantage of. And it can help a lot of rural communities. Like Northern Ontario is highly dependent on forestry as well as mining, as we previously touched on. And we've seen a lot of struggles in that area as forestry has ramped down. Just this past week in Kapuskasing or Timmins, we saw a sawmill close down, and it's just devastated the community, as that's all they have. So
Yeah,
it's a
yeah,
big.
that's a really, really good call out, and it is interesting. I do need to personally look into those examples further, but I'm probably right in assuming that those cancellations or the shutting down of those mills was combinations of factors that are outside of the millwright's control, right? It's not like they had a lack of business. It's not like anything like that. I assume that it's things like the tariffs that we're experiencing and other things like that that led to these industries breaking down, which is really sad. And I think that as a country, we need to do more to support those businesses because, if one business shutting down can destroy the economic futures of an entire community, that's something that we also need to look into.
Exactly. And almost overwhelmingly to do with tariffs in this case. The lumber industry has been devastated both during the previous Trump administration and this one due to softwood tariffs and all sorts of other wood related tariffs. And it's just devastating our industry. And it's a
Yep.
big challenge that we're going to have to overcome.
Yeah, and I think that that also touches on another part of resource development. I think that we've spent a lot of time developing resources that fit our current customers. So we would develop resources be based on what the US needed. And a lot of the times we would pick projects of what to go to develop next based on, do we already have a predetermined market for X product in the United States? And I think for a long time that was beneficial for both countries up until, like you said, the first Trump administration, we had very, very strong deals when it came to natural resource development and supply. And I think that it's very telling and very eye opening to see how quickly a single or two administrations can change those types of relationships. What are things that you think that we can do to help diversify ourselves and take this as a learning experience?
It's a big question that I hope the best and brightest in Canada are working on. But the obvious way is to expand our trade partners, start doing more business with Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Australia in the Pacific, as well as the European Union, and even developing economies, Mexico, the Caribbean, South Africa, wherever. Like there's lots of opportunity for us to start expanding who we do business with, which will allow our economy to be more resilient. We also have to be less reactive. As you mentioned, a lot of the times our industry or natural resource industry was built up to support existing US demands. Before the US it was Britain. And it can be easily crippled with tariffs and stuff like that. So I would say we have to be more willing to just build up industry, even if we don't have a direct need for it yet, or it's probably not the right word.
No, I think that that's a really good way to put it. I think, and you touched on a few good things there. So I'm glad that you mentioned Mexico and the European Union. I know that our current Prime Minister Mark Carney has recently started to make the outreach. I believe promises on future deals were signed with both the European Union and with Mexico individually.
Mhm.
So those are great things to see. And I think that you touched on something really important: how we for a long time had a very reactive stance on a lot of things, whether it's military or resource development. I think that going forward, Canada needs to take a much more focused perspective. We need to be developing things that we need and that we know the world needs, but not necessarily that we already have a customer for. We've we've done the research now to the point where we can understand that certain goods like nickel, gold, platinum, uranium, those are going to have a customer in the future, regardless of who that customer is. So we shouldn't be tied down on trying to find that customer before we get the product. We should work like a business in the sense that we're creating a good product, and we know that if we have a good product, we'll have somebody to sell it to. So I think you touched on a really good point there. And I think that kind of goes into, we've talked now about our current state. So we can talk a little bit more about the future state of Canadian resource development and kind of where we think that major areas should be worked upon. Do you have any thoughts immediately on future resource development in Canada?
Ooh. We have so many areas to target as we have so much untapped potential. The one that springs to my mind is the Ring of Fire project, which is in northern Ontario. It's a massive deposit, 400 kilometers north of Thunder Bay. It has chromite, copper, nickel, platinum, titanium, and a few other things, all of which are pretty desperately needed for the world economy. So it would be a natural area for us to start looking into expanding. I know Doug Ford's been talking about it, but we haven't seen a huge amount of progress yet. How about you? Do you have any areas?
Yeah, see, sorry. I think that that's a great one. I think the Ring of Fire project, I need to do more personal research into it. But like you said, it's a minerals project in Northern Ontario. And I think that that ties in perfectly to what we're saying. I hope that we can get more than a discussion from Doug Ford on it. Hopefully we can see some actual movement. That's one thing that we've had with Ontario governments in the past is a little bit of stagnation where they'll claim a bunch of great things and then there's not much delivered in the of economy movement. But yeah, I
For
completely
sure.
agree with you there. I think one that is another beneficial, kind of along the same veins, is actually small modular reactors. So using our uranium stores, which are some of the largest in the world, and becoming a leader in nuclear energy. There really isn't any world leader currently in nuclear energy. I think you could maybe say China, but China, because of the vast different energies they produce, they're not really a world leader in any of them because they kind of do them all and they do them all pretty well. Canada has some clout in the nuclear sphere because of our CANDU reactors that we've been able to produce and send around the world to many different countries like India and a few others. I think South Korea might have one. So I think that if we can use some of our natural resources like our uranium to build out a small modular reactor plan across Canada, we can start to become that nuclear leader for the Western world and show how that can be an effective energy production method. I think another one that would be interesting is expanding our potash production. I think that has for a long time been a backbone of Canadian resource exports. And I think that recently we've seen some other nations start to prove out large banks of potash resourcing, but they're not currently actually doing the work of developing those resources and actually extracting them and selling them. So there's been some recent communication on the Canadian market about, should we or should we not continue with potash at such a high rate? But I think we should, because until we actually have competition in the market, we're still the market leader, and we don't want to give up that market leadership because there's competition. Are there any other sort of competitive projects or anything like that you'd like to touch on?
Just touching on potash, it's our biggest mineral, or we're the biggest producer of it in the world, and it's essential in fertilizer, right? So I don't see any reason to stop producing it. Arguably, we should be expanding it. There's never going to be any shortage of demand for fertilizer. So it's definitely something we should keep looking at. I guess this one is a bit more controversial, but possibly pipelines, an east-west pipeline. I know It's not a super popular idea, but right now, especially in Europe, they've lost access to Russian gas, and it's causing crippling energy shortages, high prices, a lot of unnecessary suffering in Europe. And it's one area where we could step up. We have lots of liquid natural gas and oil. If we can get that to the East Coast efficiently, could be a way where we step in and replace Russian oil for Western Europe. Though I understand the environmental concerns of many people regarding that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you touched on a really important thing and kind of a few points on that one. Not only are the Europeans facing issues buying Russian oil, they're now being told by the Americans that if they want American help in defending Europe, they're not going to be allowed to buy Russian oil at all, not even a single drop. And right now they don't have the suppliers to make up that difference between the amount of Russian oil they currently buy and the amount that they'll need to buy from other sources. So, like you're saying, I think that Canada could be a massive supplier of that. As a party, the Canadian Future Party, we support a natural resource pipeline that goes cross country, and I think that what you're saying, the East West pipeline, I think that falls perfectly into that train of thought where we need to have something that's across the country where we can move resources from one area to another area effectively, quickly. We can, have some reactive nature where if a country needs oil right away, we'll actually be able to get it to them rather than sending thoughts and prayers. So I definitely agree with you that would be a massive benefit to Canada.
One other area I think we could improve on, it's been in the news lately, is getting a new port on the Hudson's Bay. Right now, we're limited to Churchill, which is less than ideal. Its port facilities are antiquated, and the train tracks to get to it run over tundra and permafrost, which make train speed limits very, very low, which really cripples our ability to get any natural resources onto ships in the Hudson's Bay and then over to Europe, wherever. In the news, they've talked about Port Nelson, which is also on the Hudson's Bay, but it's on bedrock, allowing trains not to have speed limits as the bedrock is far more stable than tundra for that. And there's already rough existing port facility in Port Nelson. During the First World War, we attempted to build a city. It reached 1,500 people in a big port, but kind of faded away and was abandoned. So it could be an interesting opportunity to have that built up over the next few years to give a way to get prairie goods into the Hudson's Bay and then across to Europe.
Absolutely. And again, you touch on another really important thing. It's one thing to have lots of natural resource projects in production in Canada, but unless we have effective ways to export those, from these pipelines or ports, it's not going to really benefit us from a GDP perspective. So yeah, I think having a port like that would be incredibly useful. I think another thing that touches on, and this is more for a future episode where we talk about military and expansion there, but I think that having a new port on the Hudson would also allow for more shipbuilding on our eastern coast, which would be really great because we have a lot of resources that can benefit shipbuilding, and so the ability to actually do so en masse would be a great use of those resources and allow us to have other finished goods like ships that we could sell to other nations where we could make massive profit from those types of things.
Absolutely.
If we want to talk about slightly more controversial energy topics, just to have a little bit more fun as we're getting closer to the end of this podcast, I think one that is interesting that Canada could look into would be carbon capture and storage. So I think that there's a lot of debate about the efficacy of carbon capture and storage and if it'll ever get to a point where the price to do so is effective. But I think that if we don't spend the money to do the research into carbon capture storage, we're never going to know if it's worthwhile or not. And I think that it's beneficial to put some money into this technology, whether it works or not, so that we can at least say that we tried. Do you have any thoughts on carbon capture and storage?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely controversial. I know a lot of people, particularly on the right, but also the left, who don't really agree with it or see it as like a way to cheat and avoid having to stop using oil. But we have the technical know-how. We have some of the brightest minds in the environmental industry or field in Canada. Why not give it a try and invest some money? Tell our scientists, our university educated people to go at it, start working to see if carbon capture is feasible. Because if it does work, that's good for us and it can help reverse the damage of carbon emissions in our atmosphere. So I don't see any problems with at least giving it a shot.
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree. I think actually it's funny you touched on another thing there that I think is important. I think a lot of the times when we have discussions about natural resource extraction, it becomes inherently a green versus anti-green discussion. And I think that a lot of the times resource extraction is on the anti-green side and resource, maintenance is on the green side. And I think that carbon capture storage is one of those cases where it's actually green to produce the end result from carbon capture storage because you're realistically removing carbon from the air. But that touches further on that kind of same topic. Sometimes we need to use the revenue or the income that we get from less green energy sources like oil, natural gas, all of those types of things to pay for a green future. I think there's a lot of the times where you have discussions where green energy is the topic of debate. The people promoting the green side have a very idealistic view where you just say, hey, let's stop using oil and start using green. And there's not really a discussion about the transition between oil and green energy. And, how do we get to a place where green energy can support the amount of energy production that oil does? Before I go on, did you have any thoughts on kind of that so far?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate and respect the work that environmentalists do. They're fighting a good fight, but I agree that they're a bit too idealistic and expect unrealistic things with the transition from oil to green. I don't think it's possible to just snap your fingers overnight and get there. And I absolutely agree that we should be using our less green resources like oil and gas to fund our environmental projects. Norway, for example, uses their sovereign wealth fund funded by their oil to develop new green technologies to build up Norway's green sector for the eventuality that oil and gas will no longer be needed. So it might be something worth trying here too.
I'm really glad you brought up Norway because that's the example that kind of came to my mind as well. So yeah, I think that it's not inherently an anti-green idea to increase our production of oil and natural gas in the short term if we do so with the agreement and the understanding that the reason we're doing that is to have the available GDP to invest in green energy like nuclear and like solar and like more hydro. If we can, because currently Canada has a lot of is having some economic troubles. I'm not going to say a lot, but we are having some economic troubles. We're seeing rising prices in many different fields, whether it's energy itself or it's groceries or all these things. They all come back to the base level of the economy. And so if we can have a little bit more free money in the government to invest in projects that support green energy, I think that that's a good trade-off and one that environmentalists might make if they took a little bit more time to research into the benefits of how that model could lay out. But like you said, I absolutely respect the work that environmentalists are doing in keeping our whole world safe, safe from ourselves. So I don't want any environmentalists to think that these kind of projects are meant to strictly just to strip mine the earth and take everything from it. I completely don't believe that myself. I think that we need to be doing everything we can to be progressing and getting to a better future. And I do think that has a cost.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So then the last major thing that I wanted to touch on is just some constraints and dependencies. So one of them is infrastructure. So one of the things we've talked about a lot is doing stuff in Northern Ontario or some of the northern provinces. One of the main gaps right now that I think we need to solve as a nation is the where those resources are. are very far away from where people are. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we don't want resource extraction to be, interrupting the daily lives of our citizens. That's not necessarily the case. But there's, cases where these mines and these minerals are hundreds of kilometers away from literal just highways or roads that we can use to transport them. And because of the harsh environment with the Canadian Shield and the tundra and the permafrost, and actually also because of our vast forestry, it's a little bit hard to complete some of these projects. Do you have any thoughts on how we can start to rectify that?
It's going to be a massive task in a lot of places, because as you say, they're hundreds of kilometers from major existing infrastructure. So we're going to have to put up the money and the manpower to build these projects, these infrastructure projects. And it'll cost a lot in the short term. There's no denying that. But in the long term, it creates jobs to build the infrastructure. It eventually allows for the new natural resource extraction sites to get off the ground and start processing, which in turn creates more jobs. And in a lot of cases, it can help revitalize northern communities. Northern Ontario, for example, is struggling. And the addition of infrastructure projects on top of building up our natural resource sector would be massively beneficial for them to get back on track to prosperity.
Absolutely. The next one I want to touch on is the fact that there's a large delay between the inception of some of these projects and when they're actually, when they actually start producing materials. And we've talked a lot on this podcast today about the benefits of the Canadian way of doing things, where we're, some of the safest, cleanest producers of these products and materials on Earth. That style of doing things comes with a cost, and that cost a lot of the times is time. So where other countries might have a project started this month and they're breaking ground on actually getting stuff out of there 6-9 months down the line, in some cases here it's 12 to 15 years between when a project is created and when we actually start doing things. What do you think about the pros and cons of that system?
Well, the obvious pros are that there's a lot of short-term thinking going around in companies and in government, and that 12 to 15-year process is pretty unappealing to companies or even government to set up extraction sites. So it's a major roadblock for us to develop our natural resources, probably the single most above maybe infrastructure, or only below infrastructure in terms of the biggest challenges to our natural resource expansion. But it's done with a fair degree of responsibility. A lot of that time is spent doing environmental assessments, where our environmentalists, other scientists go up, they study the natural environment there, then the mines have to provide an impact assessment to show how their mine, or how the mine, the oil well, whatnot, will impact the environment, and they have to find ways to mitigate that. So yeah, that adds a lot of time, but I think it's a good thing. We should be trying to be as environmentally conscious as we can when producing these natural resources. And it's also done to protect the communities up there. Just off the top of my head, there's a pulp mill in Dryden that was dumping mercury into the English Wabigoon waterways for decades, impacting Grassy Narrows First Nations and many others as a result of the company's negligence. So allowing this extra time to do environmental impact assessments is a major safeguard to protect all Canadians and our natural environment. So
I could not agree more.
it's the game of pros and cons, right?
Yep, it always is. And the last one I wanted to mention there is another common talking point when talking about resource development and being such a resource development heavy nation is prices can swing, right? We're seeing massive changes in the major oligarchies around the world. We're talking Saudi Arabia, UAE, Venezuela, lots of those countries who experienced massive economic boons starting in the early 90s and going into the early 2000s are starting to see a retraction of their economy because they were so heavily focused on natural resources. how does Canada, as a naturally resource heavy country, protect ourselves from that type of massive economic swing?
That is like the single greatest challenge of any resource-based economy. I would say we have to start diversifying, spread out to all natural resources we can, and if necessary, rebuild our manufacturing industry. And we just don't want to put all our eggs in one basket. We need to do natural resource extraction, but if we rely solely on it, and even if we rely solely on one type of natural resource, we become extremely vulnerable to these sorts of price swings, retraction, so on. So just diversifying is our best foot forward.
Absolutely. And I think that luckily we're doing a pretty good job of that, having a massive both gas industry, mining industry, forestry industry, and there's also water resources that we didn't really touch on today. So I think we're doing a great job of that. And I sincerely agree that that's the only way we can really protect ourselves in the coming world. That's the end of what I had. Do you have any closing points that you wanted to talk about, Nathan?
Not particularly. I'm just happy for this first podcast episode to be going so well, and having such a thoughtful discussion.
Thank you very much. And that's going to be all from us here at the CFP Youth Wing. And we hope you guys had a good time listening to us and hope you guys come back for our next one. Thank you very much.